April 23, 1944. Somewhere over the Pacific coast, the DC-3 transport banked hard through the fog, and General Heinrich Becker pressed his face against the cold glass. Below, through breaks in the clouds, a constellation of lights spread across the black water like molten gold poured from the heavens. San Francisco, unblackened, unafraid, impossible. Before we continue with this story of transformation and disillusionment, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments where you're watching from, and let us know if your grandparents ever told stories about the home front during the war. These voices matter, and your engagement helps preserve these histories for future generations. Becker had memorized every intelligence briefing. American cities, they said, were rationed into darkness. Industrial centers crippled by strikes and shortages. A nation too soft for total war, too divided to endure. Yet here, suspended between belief and evidence, he watched headlights trace the Embarcadero like fireflies in formation. The Bay Bridge glowed end to end, a spine of steel and light, connecting worlds that should not exist. Every window and every building burned without hesitation. And in that moment, staring at a city that refused to hide, Becker realized Germany had already lost the war. The journey that brought German generals to American soil was not born of mercy. In early 1944, Allied intelligence began relocating senior Axis prisoners from North Africa and Europe to the continental United States. Security was one reason, deep interrogation another, but the unspoken purpose ran deeper, to expose them to the industrial reality their propaganda had denied. American officers called it orientation through observation. The Germans would later describe it as defeat in slow motion. Becker and his fellow officers, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps and the blood-soaked fields of France, had been schooled in contempt. Party instructors taught them that America was a nation without soul, a mongrel democracy where jazz replaced discipline, wealth replaced courage, and racial mixing corroded unity. Even in captivity, the myth persisted. They expected a rich but clumsy giant, a place soft with luxury, incapable of the precision and sacrifice that Prussian minds demanded of greatness. The numbers told a different story, though few of them knew it yet. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 85,000 aircraft. Germany managed 25,000. American shipyards launched a new cargo vessel every 8 hours. The Reich struggled to replace what the Atlantic swallowed. By the time Becker's transport left England, the United States had mobilized 12 million men, fed 2 continents, and still maintained store shelves stocked with goods German civilians hadn't seen in years. But numbers were abstractions. Light was proof. The flight from Europe had taken 3 days, island hopping across the Atlantic in a lumbering transport that reeked of oil and salt. The prisoners sat in silence, shackled to bench seats, watched by MPs who chewed gum and read comic books. When they crossed into American airspace, the pilot announced it casually over the intercom. "Gentlemen, welcome to the land of the free." One of the guards laughed. Becker did not. Then came the descent into San Francisco, and with it the first crack in the ideology that had shaped their entire lives. From 10,000 feet, the city appeared as a grid of brilliance etched into the coastline. Market Street blazed like a river of fire. Neon signs flickered in colors Becker had forgotten existed. The docks, even at this hour, swarmed with activity. Cranes swung cargo under floodlights. Freighters lined the piers like iron sentinels. Somewhere below, a ferry horn moaned across the bay, and the sound carried up through the thin cabin walls, mournful and alive. "They waste power for beauty," Becker whispered. The American lieutenant, seated across from him, smiled faintly, mistaking the tone. "Pretty sight, isn't it, General? That's California for you." The words drifted through the engine hum, casual and devastating. Inside Germany, darkened cities meant survival. Light invited bombers. The officers had memorized blackout procedures, lived by them, enforced them with penalties of imprisonment or death. Now, from the cold steel belly of an enemy aircraft, the equation reversed itself. These streets glowed freely. A declaration of confidence louder than any artillery barrage. General Kurt Schreiber pulled a notebook from his coat and scribbled a single line across the page, hand trembling slightly. "The enemy's cities shine like constellations. Our propaganda men have never seen the night." When the wheels touched down at Hamilton Field, floodlights turned the tarmac into a sea of white. The prisoners blinked against the glare, half-blind. Around them, dozens of soldiers moved with brisk efficiency. Mechanics, drivers, women in service uniforms filing documents under open bulbs. None of them seemed afraid of being seen. Becker stepped onto American soil for the first time and felt the hum beneath his boots. Generators. Somewhere beyond the fence, the low thrum of electrical grids pulsed through the earth like a heartbeat. He had felt nothing like it since before the war, and even then, never at this scale. "They live as though the war were finished," he murmured. It wasn't contempt in his voice, it was envy. Trucks whisked them south through the night, canvas flaps tied back to let in the cool bay air. Through the slats, fragmentary images flickered past. Newspaper boys shouting headlines about Pacific victories. Women in hats laughing under neon signs outside cafes, still open past midnight. A red marquee rolling by. "Casablanca tonight, 8 p.m. The letters burned brighter than any street lamp in Hamburg. Becker couldn't help the bitter smile that rose to his lips. Even their theaters mocked his army's defeats. Yet it wasn't ridicule that stung. It was normalcy. The enemy had managed to wage total war while keeping its soul intact. One of the younger officers, a lieutenant named Muller, leaned forward. "Where is the rationing? Where are the cues?" The MP riding shotgun glanced back, genuinely confused. "Cues for what?" "For food." "For fuel," the guard laughed. "Buddy, this is America. We got more than we know what to do with." Muller sat back, silent. The words landed like a verdict. At the ferry terminal, the convoy paused to let a column of civilian vehicles pass. Becker watched them roll by, one after another, sedans, coupes, station wagons, paint gleaming, chrome catching moonlight. In Germany, private automobiles had been requisitioned years ago. Here they flowed like a peacetime parade. Schreiber tapped the steel rail beside his seat. "This is no military state, no," Becker replied quietly. "It's something worse. It's voluntary." That single realization, prosperity born not from coercion but from participation, burrowed deep into their thoughts. For soldiers raised to believe that sacrifice required suffering, that strength demanded deprivation, America's casual abundance felt like a moral inversion. The system rewarded its citizens for contributing to victory. Everyone became both investor and beneficiary. When they finally reached the detention barracks outside the city, The glow of San Francisco still pulsed faintly through the fog to the west. Becker stood at the barred window long after the others had collapsed into bunks. Sleep would not come. He wrote in the margin of his diary, ink smudging in the damp air, captured by light more than by force. The cross-country journey began 3 days later. A military train, windows unblackened, rolled east through the heartland. The prisoners were given seats near the rear, guarded but not shackled. They pressed against the glass like children, watching a nation unfold in daylight. First came the Sierra Nevada, peaks still capped with snow. Then the Nevada desert, vast and empty, broken only by rail sidings and water towers. At every stop, they glimpsed the machinery of American logistics in motion. Freight cars stacked with crates marked for the Pacific. Troop trains heading west, G is leaning from windows, waving at strangers. Telephone poles marching endlessly toward the horizon, wires humming with invisible conversations. One afternoon the train slowed to let a westbound convoy pass. Tanks on flat cars. Artillery pieces chained down under tarps. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, all painted olive drab, all moving with the precision of a system that had never known interruption. Becker counted them. 32 flat cars. 114 vehicles. All replacements for losses that America could afford to absorb. He thought of the Tiger tanks abandoned in Tunisia for lack of fuel, the Panthers immobilized in France for want of spare parts, the Luftwaffe grounded because synthetic oil plants had been bombed into rubble. "We are not fighting an army," Schreiber said beside him. "We are fighting a factory." In Chicago, the train stopped for supplies. The prisoners were allowed a brief stretch under guard on the platform. Union Station rose around them like a cathedral of steel and marble. Civilians hurried past in every direction, businessmen, nurses, black porters carrying luggage, children clutching comic books and candy bars. Becker stood motionless, absorbing the movement itself. Every face carried certainty of destination. These people were not marching to orders. They were moving by will. The loudspeaker overhead announced departures in a voice calm and bored. Train 42, now boarding eastbound platform. Geography, not ideology. Travel as choice, not command. He thought of the announcements in Berlin. Ration cuts, air raid instructions, exhortations to sacrifice. Here, the loudspeaker sold tickets to Cleveland. That night, as the train rolled through Indiana farmland, Becker couldn't sleep. He stared out at the darkness, broken every few miles by the lights of small towns. Each one glowed softly, unafraid. Grain elevators lit for night shifts. Diners open late. Gas stations with red neon signs promising fuel without coupons. Mahler sat beside him, equally awake. "Do they even know there's a war?" "They know," Becker said. "They simply refuse to let it define them." The train reached the East Coast a week later, and with it the full weight of American industrial power. New York Harbor stretched before them like a vision from a fever dream. Hundreds of ships crowded the piers. Liberty's ships in rows of 6. Cruisers riding high after unloading troops. Tankers low in the water, heavy with fuel. Cranes moved like mechanical giants, swinging cargo nets from hold to dock in rhythms so precise they seemed choreographed. Becker tried to count the vessels. He lost track at 80. From the harbor they were trucked to a processing center in New Jersey. The drive took them through industrial districts that stretched for miles. Factories with smokestacks breathing soot into overcast skies. Rail yards crackling with arc welders. Warehouses the size of cathedrals, doors open to reveal mountains of crates stamped with eagles and stars. At one intersection, the convoy stopped for a red light. Across the street, a billboard loomed. A woman in coveralls, sleeves rolled up, flexing her arm beneath the slogan, "We can do it." Beside her, another sign advertised war bonds. Back the attack, buy bonds today. Schreiber stared at the image, then turned to Becker. They weaponized pride. No, Becker replied. They democratized it. The distinction mattered. In Germany, propaganda demanded obedience. In America, it invited participation. The difference was subtle but absolute. One system required subjects. The other cultivated stakeholders. At the detention center, interrogators began their work. The questions were polite, almost conversational. What units had they commanded? What supply lines had they relied on? What did they think of American equipment? The officers answered carefully, giving names and dates but little tactical insight. Then, casually, an American colonel asked, "What surprised you most about the United States?" Becker hesitated. The question felt like a trap, but the colonel's face held no malice, only curiosity. "The lights," Becker said finally. "You waste nothing on darkness." The colonel nodded. "We figured out long time ago that fear in the dark costs more than electricity." The answer sat in the room like a truth neither man wanted to touch. Weeks passed. The prisoners settled into routines. Work details, English lessons, recreation hours in a fenced yard where they could see the Manhattan skyline rising to the south, always visible, always bright. Slowly, the camp library began to fill with requests. Engineering manuals, city planning texts, economic theory. Becker spent hours sketching street grids from memory, trying to understand what he had seen, the logic beneath the chaos, how energy, commerce, and life intertwined without coercion. Over the sketches he wrote the same phrase again and again, organization without tyranny. Schreiber walked the perimeter each morning, speaking with guards. One farm boy from Iowa described how his town had pooled money during the Depression to build a power plant. "We each owned a share," the boy said proudly. "Still do." Schreiber nodded slowly. "So you created light together." The concept was foreign. Collective ambition uncoerced by fear. He began to understand that this was what none of their theories had ever contained, the possibility that people might build empires, not because they were commanded, but because they believed. In July, news reached the camp. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. Paris would fall within weeks. The prisoners gathered around the radio in silence, listening to the BBC announcer describe the collapse of Army Group B. Some wept. Others sat stone-faced. Becker felt only a strange, hollow relief. He had known since San Francisco. The rest had simply taken longer to see. By spring of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler dead in his bunker. Berlin a smoking ruin. The camp loudspeaker crackled with the announcement, and the American voice reading it sounded calm, almost bored. Surrender expected within days. Even victory, it seemed, did not require shouting. That night, the guards left the canteen radio on. Jazz drifted over the fences. Becker sat on the barracks steps, staring toward the faint glow on horizon. Somewhere beyond that line were the cities that had undone their arrogance, the luminous places still humming, still building, untouched by ruin. He wrote in his diary one last time, "They fought with freedom itself as energy. We had no weapon against that." Months later, orders came for repatriation. The remaining generals would return through New York, boarding ships bound for a Europe they no longer recognized. Their names still carried rank, but the certainty behind them had thinned. What remained was observation and uneasy respect they had never expected to feel. The train carried them east across a landscape unscarred by war. Fields rolled past in uninterrupted green summer wheat, bending gently in the wind. There were no shell craters, no burned villages, no bridges hastily repaired with timber and prayer. Highways ran parallel to tracks, crowded with civilian traffic, families in sedans, delivery trucks, buses filled with workers heading home at dusk. Factories stood whole and humming, their smokestacks no longer feeding the war, but turning out refrigerators, radios, washing machines, objects of comfort, not survival. The men watched in silence. No one reached for a notebook. There was nothing here that fit their training. Outside Philadelphia, Becker glimpsed a new neighborhood blooming from former farmland. Rows of identical houses stretched toward the horizon, white walls, red roofs, lawns freshly seeded. Children rode bicycles between driveways. A woman hung laundry in the late afternoon sun. It looked provisional, almost fragile, yet it was expanding in every direction. "They multiply comfort," Becker said quietly, more to himself than to the others. From behind him, someone answered, "And call it liberty." No one laughed. The remark held no contempt. It sounded like a realization spoken too late. At New York Harbor, fog settled over the skyline as their transport ship prepared to depart. Dock workers moved with practiced efficiency, loading crates, securing lines, shouting instructions that cut through the mist. Through the gray haze, the silhouette of Manhattan rose like the skeleton of some immense creature buildings stacked into impossible vertical cities, steel and stone climbing where no fortress wall ever had. Musings like the Sir Lascaux never had. Lights blinked across their flanks despite the fog, refusing darkness. Becker removed his cap. "We were wrong," he said at last. "We thought cities were cages for the weak. They are hives for the capable." None of the men argued. No one reached for ideology or excuse. Each simply stared upward, memorizing the future they would not belong to. As the liner eased from the pier, the skyline receded into cloud. The outlines soft, then vanished. But the lights did not dim. They glimmered across the water like embers refusing to die, and Becker understood that this was the monument his empire had failed to comprehend. Not built of marble or triumphal arches, not guarded by soldiers or sanctified by blood, but sustained by belief. The conviction that tomorrow could be brighter, that abundance was achievable, that freedom itself could be a foundation sturdy enough to build upon, tear down, and build again. He closed his notebook and tucked it into his coat. The last words he would ever write on foreign soil were simple, stripped of rhetoric. A civilization that can build and rebuild within the same breath cannot be conquered. Perhaps, he thought, what shines from their cities is not power, but faith. The Atlantic opened before them, dark and cold, endless and indifferent. Behind them, the American coast faded into memory. Yet the glow remained, imprinted on their minds like the afterimage of staring too long at the sun. They had crossed continent, bathed in light, and in that radiance they had seen their own twilight reflected back at them. They returned to a shattered homeland carrying no trophies, no victories to display. Only a lesson no propaganda could erase, that survival did not have to be cruel, that ambition could be moral, that a people unafraid of the dark could choose to illuminate the world rather than dominate it. And in those glowing American cities, the defeated learned what victory truly looked like. Not a tomb, not a statue, not a banner frozen in time, but streetlight left burning through the night, promising that morning would come.